Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Saturday everybody. It is the weekend, so today's video will be quite foreign policy and geopolitics heavy. One brief matter before we start with the main stories. Yesterday, General Secretary Xi Jinping officially won a third term as state president. The final vote, 2,952 votes to 0. Okay. Let's start with the main developments and begin with Canada-China. This week, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau ordered an investigation into accusations of Chinese interference in elections, the latest development in a growing political scandal in the Anglophone Middle Power, which came to public light several weeks ago after Canadian outlet The Globe and Mail published leaked accusations of PRC interference from national intelligence bodies. Trudeau announced that the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, which reports directly to the Prime Minister's office, will, quote, study China's interference in the 2019 and 2021 elections. End quote. He also said the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency, which oversees the RCMP and federal spy agencies, quote, will examine how investigations into Chinese election meddling have been handled. End quote. Some domestic opposition commentators have complained that this process is too secretive. Of course, Beijing denies any wrongdoing. Chinese state media writes this week that the Canadian move is unwarranted and has ulterior motives. Quote, the major objective of his move is to coordinate Canada's diplomatic strategy to match that of the US by creating an unfriendly atmosphere towards China among the Canadian public. This will harm Canada's national image, reducing it to the status of a US follower, observers warned. End quote. This final point is a common accusation leveled by state media at nations that adopt a policy undesired by Beijing. Okay, next up, let's jump across the Atlantic to Western Europe and specifically to Dutch chips. This week, we got more details on how the Netherlands will work with the US and Japan, the key chip-making technology exporters, in blocking the export of advanced technology critical to Chinese chip-building ambitions. Quote, given the technological developments and geopolitical context, the government has concluded that it is necessary for the international security to expand the existing export controls on specific manufacturing equipment for semiconductors. End quote. The Dutch trade minister continued that the new export control measures include the most advanced deep ultraviolet DUV machines, which are part of ASML's advanced chip printers portfolio. US media outlet Politico writes that the Dutch firm, which is the highest valued tech company in Europe, already did not receive export licenses for selling its most advanced machines using extreme ultraviolet light EUV technology to China since 2019. Adding that in a ASML statement, the company confirmed that it will now, quote, need to apply for export licenses for shipment of the most advanced DUV systems, end quote. But it noted that it has not received yet any details about what most advanced means. On this development, the Hong Kong-based South China Morning Post writes that, quote, the latest restriction is not expected to prevent China from buying legacy semiconductor manufacturing technology from ASML and other major chip-making gear suppliers, end quote. The outlet quotes an unnamed executive at a major Beijing-based chip equipment maker who told the outlet that, quote, it would be too extreme to ban China from buying equipment for decades-old chip-making process nodes, end quote. Currently, analysts are debating what exactly the Japanese and Dutch chip bans will look like. Quote, the full details are unlikely to be known until the Dutch and Japanese governments publish their updated export control regulations, which will take months. In the meantime, however, there are plenty of clues to the deal's contents from a careful analysis of 3 elements. 1. The role that Dutch and Japanese companies play in the global semiconductor value chain. 2. The revealed policy preferences of the Biden administration based on the content of the October 7 regulations. and 3. The nature of the underlying legal authorities that constitute the Dutch export control system. This paper addresses each in turn." End quote. The paper is certainly worth a read for anyone interested in this topic. Finally, for today's video, storm clouds gather in the Pacific. Hey guys, if you're enjoying this episode of China Update, don't forget to hit that like button. And as always, anyone who appreciates what I'm doing here with the channel and go the extra mile to help me continue making these episodes 6 days a week, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. Finally, for today, there are several important developments related to Australia-China dynamics that affect the regional geopolitical picture, which we need to cover. Let's start with the positive. Trade. The trading relationship appears to be slowly renormalizing, first with coal and then with cotton these last several weeks. State media in China has produced stories about the return of cotton, with, quote, approximately several thousand tons of Australian cotton recently arriving in the Qingdao port, East China's Shandong province, and were delivered to Chinese clients, end quote, in the words of one outlet. Coal demand has returned, too, with the Australia-based Sydney Morning Herald quoting an industry insider earlier this month as expressing, quote, there are early signs that the informal ban on Australian coal imports to China may be in the process of being removed, end quote. We remember that many Australian exporters have faced informal barriers to trade from Beijing after Canberra called for an investigation into the origins of the pandemic back in 2020. Okay, let's move to the friction now in the relationship. Australia has recently, quietly, blocked a bid by a Chinese-linked company to increase its ownership in rare earth supplier Northern Minerals Limited, potentially testing the renewed, warmer bilateral diplomatic ties. A Singapore-based fund owned by a Chinese national applied in August last year to double its ownership in the Australian company to approximately 20%. However, Australia's treasurer blocked the transaction last month, citing, quote, advice from the Foreign Review Investment Board, end quote, without giving further details. Meanwhile, on the military front, this coming Monday, the 13th of March, US President Joe Biden and the Prime Ministers of the UK and Australia are expected to reveal the details of the provision of the nuclear-powered submarines and other high-tech weapons to Australia, technology which previously the US and the UK only shared with each other. US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan recently said that he felt very good about how much could be shared with Australia. Indeed, some expect Australia to buy up to 5 Virginia-class submarines. The US would also forward deploy some submarines in Western Australia by around 2027, according to some leaks. US-based New York Times writes that a Virginia-class submarine requires a crew of 132, including 15 officers, adding that even if the service members report to Australian commanders, many, if not most of the crew, may have to be American. Other reports argue that Australia's new fleet of nuclear-powered submarines will be based on a modified British design with US parts and upgrades. By the way, my thanks in advance to those who are no doubt currently writing in the comments the correct pronunciation of nuclear. China's foreign ministry on Thursday expressed that the arms-sharing agreement between the 3 Anglophone nations, quote, undermines peace and stability in the Asia-Pacific region, end quote. The prospect of war with China is now being discussed in popular Australian discourse too. This month, Australia-based Sydney Morning Herald published a widely read special article titled Red Alert! Australia is not ready for war with China within 3 years. Quote, Australia's government has not told the people about the seriousness of the threat the country faces. That's the verdict of a group of 5 experts brought together by the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age for a review of Australia's national security, who blew away the fog of war to give Australians some critical points of honest insight. Their consensus? The overwhelming source of danger to Australia is from China. The nature of the threat extends to the prospect of a full-scale war, and Australia would have to be involved. End quote. The popular piece also sparked some domestic controversy. For example, former Australian Prime Minister Paul Keating called the article, quote, the most egregious and provocative news presentation in 5 decades. End quote. The former leader has long advocated that Australia must not get sucked into a war over Taiwan. Australian critics of his position, however, argue that if the PRC succeeded in such a conflict, then Beijing would be able to exert the same degree of hegemonic power in Asia as the Empire of Japan did back in the 1930s and early 1940s, when it then threatened Australia with invasion. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. I tried to keep the episode light. It did get a little heavy there at the end, but nonetheless, let's try now to enjoy our weekend. I will see you all back here for China Update on Monday.